Look, a lot of people care about the environment, but just about everybody cares about having power and heat available when they need it. So people should care about geothermal because it's really one of the only sources of energy that's both emission-free and runs 24/7. Geothermal is all about the subsurface, right? It's all about energy beneath our feet that we don't see. And I think typically as humans, if we don't see it, if we can't see it and touch it, we tend not to focus on it. Other renewables, you can see them at the surface. You've got windmills, you've got, solar panels that provide that visual representation of what's going on. Whereas, a geothermal plant at best is, some pipes sticking out of the ground. And so it's just tough to, I guess, advertise for geothermal. We really need to focus as a community, as an industry, maybe less on the technologies, and more on what are the benefits? What does geothermal really do? And try to maybe use that from an imagery standpoint for the industry to say, look here, you can be both, green and have energy all the time, and maybe really show the fruits of our labor rather than the actual facilities, for instance. I think the seed actually was planted a very long time ago. There was actually a house on our street when I was growing up that had a geothermal system. And I just thought, I remember thinking as a kid, that was just so cool that they were getting energy, from the earth, from inside the earth. And I think that triggered me to go, kind of planted the seed to go into geoscience. And then the energy industry. I'm very optimistic about the future of geothermal. I think that with the help of organizations and events, for instance, like Pivot here, for example, people are beginning to wake up, I think, to the enormous potential that geothermal has to power our civilization, and bridge that gap to get us to a renewable energy future. It's going to take a lot of hard work. It's going to take a ton of perseverance from startups like us to big businesses alike to both make a near-term impact right now, and then also to work on, the innovations and the technology that we're going to need to keep the momentum going. And so, yeah, I'm very optimistic. With all hands on deck, we can make a meaningful difference for humanity.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Geothermal Business Model panel. At first blush, geothermal looks like an interesting hybrid of oil and gas and wind and solar utilities. Seems to fall between two stools. It's got the risk and subsurface uncertainty of oil and gas, but when generating power, it's got the returns of wind and solar. And is that why some companies are not jumping into geothermal with both feet, or are there other reasons? In this panel today, we'll be discussing the challenges and the opportunities that energy companies have in exploring geothermal. My name's Simon Todd. I'm the Managing Director, Co-founder, and Chief Technologist for Causeway Geothermal. We're a new energy company, and we're interested in two forms of innovation. One is technology innovation to do with everything with geothermal, but also we're interested in innovation of the business model. We believe that making both innovations work together will be a successful outcome for both our customers and our investors. So let me introduce in turn our panel today. We have got a quite brilliant panel for you to discuss these matters. And let me start with Arjun Murti. Arjun, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Simon. It's a real pleasure to be here. I just passed the 30-year mark as an energy sector equities research analyst. The first 22 years of my career were on Wall Street, primarily at Goldman Sachs, where I did retire as a partner in 2014. My focus at Goldman was mostly on the traditional energy names, the major oils, E&Ps, refiners, though I did cover or oversee some of the clean energy names, both from 20 years ago and more recently. Since 2014, I've been on the board of ConocoPhillips, a large Houston-based oil company. I'm a senior advisor to the energy group at Warburg Pincus, the private equity firm. And I'm also an advisory board member at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, a nonpartisan energy and climate policy think tank. And I think we know each other through my Substack, which I published under the Super Spiked banner, which is a newsletter about what I'm calling the messy energy transition era that is upon us. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Arjun. It's great to have you. Let's go to Dave. Dave, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Simon. It's great to be here. My name's Dave Latin. I'm the father of 3 teenage daughters who talk about the energy transition a lot. I've got 30 years associated with oil and gas globally, mainly with BP and then with OMV of Austria. And now I have a portfolio of activities which include private equity investing in oil and gas, investing and advising in technology startups, immersive technology startup, and founding a smart data startup in service of the offshore wind industry and carbon storage. And I'm a non-executive director on one of the UK's largest independent gas producers. And unfortunately, I've missed most of this conference because I've been on board meetings. So I've just got back from Aberdeen. But I do know there's loads of geothermal enthusiasts here and in the audience. And I feel a bit naked before you. And you may be disappointed to know that until I was invited by Simon a short while ago, I knew almost nothing about geothermal energy. And so I've been learning fast. And I would add that while I'm rather an outsider, I did start out my career as a geoscientist with a PhD and a postdoc researching where, when, and how the Earth melts. So actually, I understand igneous rocks and hot igneous rocks, but I probably won't be talking about that very much. Back to you, Simon.
Yes, thank you, Dave. Yeah, and you know, the outsider looking in is a very useful perspective. So welcome, Dave, to the panel. And then let's turn to Helen, please. Please introduce yourself, Helen.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm an accountant by training and come from the finance world, and will be bringing the infrastructure investor perspective to this session. I spent the first part of my career in the oil and gas sector, and in 2015, I moved into the renewables space. And since then, I've been financing the construction of a wide range of renewable technologies at utility scale: wind, biomass, anaerobic digestion. And I've now joined Deep Energy, which has been founded to invest in the next generation of geothermal power plants.
Thank you, Helen. Great to have you. And finally, Jay. Jay, please introduce yourself.
Well, hello. Thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Jay Egg. I like that Dave mentioned he's the father of 3 daughters. I have 6 adult grandchildren and 6 grandchildren. And I got my training almost 35 years ago in the United States Navy as a nuclear power engineer. And after getting out of the US Navy, started a mechanical engineering and construction company in California. About 2009, when geothermal first caught traction as part of the US stimulus package under President Obama, McGraw-Hill asked me to write a textbook on the subject of geothermal heat pumps. So I took that, and soon after, we had the opportunity, myself and a couple of co-writers, to write another graduate level textbook. And that's kind of what got me out of working in the southeastern United States to working more worldwide as a consultant. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Jay, thanks very much. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have the guy that wrote the book on the panel. So let's kick off the conversation. What I'd like to do is to get up to high altitude and look at the landscape, the energy landscape together. And Arjun, I'd like you to kick this conversation, this particular topic off. You've called the energy transition messy. Could you start painting the picture for us as context for the remainder of the discussion?
Sure, and maybe I'll start with the traditional sector. And I do appreciate in my week of listening to this conference, people have not made speeches, so I'll do my best to avoid that, and please interrupt me. But if I start with the traditional names, the profitability cycles tend to be very long-term in nature, 10 to 15 years up, 10 to 15 years down. And if I shorten the discussion, 1991 to 2006, good. We went from 8 to 10% returns to 20% level. 2006 to 2020, bad. And really over that last decade, you could argue returns on capital for the traditional sector were somewhere between 0 and 3%. This is total company profitability, not good. I do think 2020 marked the trough, and I'd characterize this now in year 2 of what could be a decade of what I think will be much improved profitability for the traditional names producing oil and gas and the related subsectors around that. And I think we're in another super cycle. Different characteristics than the China-led boom and the EM boom of the 2000s or the Arab oil embargo years of the 70s, but one that I think will be a better period for traditional names, in part because of this very messy transition era we're in. And you've got this confluence right now where traditional investors say, hey, you guys stunk last decade. A 0% return on capital is not good. Don't waste my money again. At the same time, I'm going to bucket them together for this purpose, ESG and the climate crowd saying, for a variety of reasons, we also don't want you to invest. So there's a conspiracy there to say no more oil and gas supply. And it's creating a dynamic where you're essentially out of crude oil spare capacity, inventories, and there's no desire at this point to grow supply. It doesn't mean it can't, but the desire is not there with this conspiracy of both traditional and ESG and climate type investment. The question is, how long does that last? And so while there's a lot of concern that demand might roll over in the future as we transition, in the absence of actually having transitioned, you end up in what I'm going to call a continuous demand destruction type mode, where you keep having price spikes for both crude oil and natural gas to try and motivate less demand near term down to the level of available supply. And I think that is going to characterize the type of environment we're in. Mm-hmm. I think the final point I'd just say, so my view is that crude oil demand, it might stagnate, but it's not going to stagnate because we have transitioned to electric vehicles or something else, but because there's not supply availability. Global gas, I think, and I think this is where geothermal is interesting, but at the time being, global gas is going to be that long-term opportunity for power demand. And so I think that continues. Just the final point I want to make on the macro is, certainly for the publicly traded companies, there is a goal, a commitment, a desire, a mandate to address Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And so I think the question is, how do you balance profitability? How do you balance the world's need? It has a need today for more oil and gas supply, with also the need to address your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And what is not clear to me, even after a week of this, is how does geothermal potentially fit into that as a possible solution for oil and gas companies to continue to have their societal, license to operate while absolutely producing the oil and gas that the world is still going to need.
Very good, Arjun. Dave, are you able to give us a European perspective on that, please, or Helen?
Gosh, well, Helen, do you want to go first?
You go ahead, Dave.
I completely agree. I guess where I'm at is just to come to the investment thing first. Is the oil and gas sector has been investing about half the capital that it was investing in 2014 and before, about half the capital globally since. And you can't be, the oil and gas game is about stopping a downward going escalator, right? And you can't stop that without investing. So at some point, we're going to feel a supply crunch unless demand is eaten up by everything else. And I don't think it can be. So I completely agree with what Arjun was saying. And yet you have this tension of people don't really want to invest in it anymore. They'd like to invest in cleaner, nicer things, right? Like geothermal. And then you get into the crux of the issue, I think, that's been probably discussed a fair bit, which is how do you balance the returns and the risks investing in geothermal to make it make sense for anybody, and how do you transition a company that's used to doing relatively high rate of return stuff in oil and gas into something that's more utility-like in terms of its rates of returns, which perhaps is more difficult in geothermal, it seems, than it has been in some of the other areas. So I agree completely with Arjun, I think.
Very good, yeah, and different geographic perspectives, but sort of similar view down the telescope. Helen, what would you like to add to this?
Sure. So maybe to change the focus a little bit and move away from oil and gas, which is adjacent to geothermal, and into the renewable space, the traditional renewable space, which is also adjacent to geothermal. I think there what you've seen over the last 10 years is a flood of infrastructure investment financing these wind and solar projects. It's been phenomenal. The infrastructure investment space is now in a situation where it's raised lots and lots of money to put into financing renewables projects, and there simply aren't enough traditional renewables projects to go round. So pricing for wind and solar is going up and up, returns are getting squeezed. And so these infrastructure investors are now looking for other renewables to put their money into, which is a great opportunity for geothermal.
Very good, thank you. Jay, anything to add to the context that you're seeing in your travels?
You bet. Simon, if listeners and those on the panel don't know, I have so little to do with the financial side of this, and much more involved in helping people understand the market for thermal energy. And that is been the real focus of getting folks to understand that. Earlier this week, I was with a utility that hired us to do some work in Tennessee, and they had this interesting problem. While we're engineering several thermal energy networks for their distribution territory, the president of this utility told me at dinner, and he said, I have an RFP I need to answer where we have been asked to provide 5,000 megawatts of zero carbon energy storage. And he said, understanding what an amazing offering thermal energy is, he says, I want to do that with thermal energy, not electricity, not battery storage. I am going to, and he's hiring us to answer the RFP for him on storing 5,000 megawatts of thermal energy as opposed to electric energy. And if those that are listening and those on this panel don't already know this, the losses of storing thermal energy and the cost of storing thermal energy versus electric energy is really not even comparable in efficiency losses. And beyond that, as we electrify and decarbonize buildings, and this is the most important thing that I try to teach people, and when they understand it, it changes everything. As they decarbonize and electrify anywhere where we're getting off of natural gas, the number one concern is going to electrification, having that bump in electrical consumption in the winter that used to be natural gas. If we can supply that thermal energy, which is a lot easier than most people realize, it's not even a consideration for electrical consumption in the winter. And what we have ended up with is utilities, electric utilities like Con Ed, like National Grid, like Eversource, realizing as their legislators in New York and Massachusetts and beyond are starting to make it possible for these utilities to sell thermal energy. That was not possible before. They have to actually change the law. And that's the big picture here. Once the law is changed, they can do that.
Yeah, let's that last point, Jay. Let's intend to come back to that one towards the end of the panel, because I think there's going to be a piece of how do business models work and what do authorities need in order to frame or support the market to make those business models work. So let's come back to that, please. So big, messy picture of energy transition we've painted. Now let's go into, well, what's the value proposition of a geothermal project? For example, Helen, a geothermal infrastructure project. What's the value proposition, and how does it get monetized. And you've told me, Helen, that you have a analogy to describe this with wind and solar. And I'd love for you to tell the audience about that.
Sure. So my starting point for this would be, I've spoken already about how much money has flooded into the financing of wind and solar projects over the last decade. And it's important to think about what's been behind that flood of money. And the brutal truth is that it's not that the investors want to finance the energy transition. That's nice, that's great. And increasingly, it's a hygiene factor for their investments. But really, the reason the money has flooded into those projects is they enabled investors to get access to long-term stable cash flows, typically from governments through subsidy regimes or highly creditworthy off-takers. So that's the opportunity that investors saw in wind and solar, and geothermal has to try and mirror that opportunity. So that means making sure your offtake model for a project is as strong as possible. And just to sort of remind people about what that means and the timescales you're looking at here, a geothermal project similar to other infrastructure projects, you spend a whole lot of money building it, and then it typically takes at least 10 years just to get your money back. And so you need to be confident that you'll be getting cash flows from year 10 through to year 30 to give you the return you expect on your project. So you really are looking to get long-term offtake strategies that investors can believe in for decades.
Very good. Arjun, you're an investor. How does that sound to you, that model?
I think Helen raised some great points that people might do things for, I think hygiene was her word, which I liked, but ultimately it's going to be the stability of cash flows. I think one of my big takeaways from this geothermal week has been some of the issues that I think caused shale E&Ps to underperform last decade. I see a comparable thing with solar and wind. It's a flawed metric, LCOE. And so in shale, we had well IRRs. Companies took their best well, didn't include any of the other costs, drilled on that assumption. And by the time you included all the other costs, the profitability was actually zero, not even 1% for sector on average. In the case of solar and wind, by excluding the fact that it's not 24/7 backup storage, what have you, you're able to get away with it for some of the policy reasons. I think the previous panel with my friend Rob Santangelo made some great points that when solar and wind are a small portion of the grid, a utility can simply absorb it. But as perhaps we're seeing in Europe, I'm not a European electricity expert, but as we're seeing greater quantities go into the mix, it doesn't work if you're not 24/7. And you're gonna have to pick something. It could be nuclear, it could be natural gas, but maybe it could actually be geothermal. So my question is, why doesn't the geothermal community highlight a better LCOE metric, or at least question the metric we have and say it has to account for 24/7 availability, 365. And I would suspect when you do that, it will create a better investment opportunity for geothermal. Now, as an investor, what are the policy implications? When do US states that have RPSs think more about 24/7? How does Europe deal with that? It's beyond my expertise as an energy equities research analyst. But what I would say is that's the type of policy shift I think you're going to need. We have to account for all the costs. You can't use this made up LCOE, which is a bunch of nonsense when you see what's going on and people living and potentially freezing this winter, which is a serious issue. It's not okay for the power to be intermittent. It's not okay.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Arjun. There's actually a couple of questions about what is the right way to measure value in its sort of largest definition, coming from the audience. And audience, by the way, if you have a question, stick it in the blue stripe, the blue panel at the bottom of your screen, please. Not in the chat room. Dave, you look as if you'd like to build on that discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting journey for me as I've been doing some reading and thinking about all of this. And the first complexity that comes to me is, are we talking thermal energy or are we talking electricity? And that's a big issue, right? And the reason it's a big issue is electricity is dispatchable. You move it around easily over distances. But the other issue that comes with it is you have huge conversion losses when you take geothermal energy and you make electricity out of it. So you're going to get sort of 10 to 20% of your energy gets converted into electricity. So whilst on the one hand, you've got something that's 24/7 potentially, right? You've got this big loss, and you have to account for that when you're doing the, the costing of a project, right? And on the other hand, you haven't got the capacity issues that the wind and the solar have, because you're there more of the time. But so that for me is something that, I think about when I think about all of this. And as I try and think about an infrastructure investor, and I'm not one, but I've interacted with a few, they used to come in and like to invest in oil and gas pipelines, but they never wanted to do it until the pipeline was built, full, and had lots of tariff associated. So they don't like the front end risk of the project, never mind the subsurface, the wells, and all of the other stuff, the stability of contracts, et cetera, all of that's got to be out of the way. And then, it's good. You'll go for a utilitarian type of return on a very low risk project, right? For a long time. Great. But how does one get over the hump of what stands in front of, whether it's a shallow, I think shallow geothermal, which is kind of not heat pumps, but, down to a kilometer or two, versus the very hot, dry rock stuff, right? They're very different, but they've both got risks, right? And how do you get over this risk hump at the front? They're different risks. They're very different risks, but they're risks.
No, that's great, Dave. There is this very clear distinction in the two technologies, and you nailed it in terms of efficiency and losses. And actually, the other distinction, of course, is customer, because the thermal energy customers are quite different from the perhaps from the electricity customers. Let's take your second to last point, Dave, there. So in the business of creating, and let's stick on power for the moment, and then we'll come back to thermal a little later. But let's think about who's going to take the early risk in geothermal. Who's going to start the process of creating value through exploration, if that's applicable, is certainly appraisal, and that those early stages of a subsurface project. Dave, would you like to take that on, or one of the other panelists?
I mean, I can try. I'm happy to let someone else go. So it's easy to say, well, it's got to be the big energy companies, right? Because surely they'd love it, right? They've got subsurface and wells knowledge, operational skills, project risk, blah, 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 can influence governments, stakeholders. They've got cheap sources of capital, or used to have. So you just repurpose, you repurpose good old BP and make it a geothermal, kind of enhanced geothermal company. So
why is that not happening, Dave?
Well, I think it's a few things. I mean, you've obviously got the sort of return problem, right? But if you can separate it from the oil and gas business and say, well, it doesn't have to compete with that, it's still got to compete with other things people can do with the money. And it's much riskier than wind and solar, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is scale, I think. Scale. And yes, a bit like oil and gas fields, mineable power resources, which is what they are, geothermal, really. You're sort of mining power, really. Mineable power resources are sort of, it's all about location, right? And scale. And with that come the risk. Will it be big enough? Will it last long enough? Will it support the capital you deploy? And will it make enough money quickly enough? And so it's a bit like an LNG project or something like that in some ways, right? It's big, it's got front-end risk, it needs lots of capital. So you need to be sure it's going to carry on for a very long time, and it's going to be underpinned by absolutely rock-solid commodity prices. I better stop because I go on and on about this.
Yeah,
but you could think, would mining companies be better suited, right? Maybe the miners would like it. They've certainly got
right.
some synergies too, and they've got many of the same skills. But again, it's sort of somewhat about location, right? If you happen to be near a granite that they're mining for, lithium or whatever else, then it might work. Otherwise, will it? I don't know. I'm sure others have got views on this.
So it's great. So that you've introduced the diversity of a different type of resource company being involved. Arjun, you're on the board of ConocoPhillips. Why aren't they digging into geothermal?
You're reminding me that I should have said in my introduction, I am here speaking on my own behalf and not on behalf of Conoco or Warburg. So thank you for the legal reminder there.
Yes.
I think let me build upon maybe a little bit what Dave said, but from a different perspective. I notice when I come from Wall Street, when I speak to people who are more climate oriented, there seems to be this obsession with having the big oil companies go to clean energy. And I don't understand it. Rarely does yesterday's technology leader become tomorrow's leader. My example is always Blockbuster Video did not invent streaming. Thank goodness Blockbuster didn't buy Netflix, and Netflix was able to, in a very capital-intensive business, create the miracle that is Netflix and all the other services that now exist. The idea that any of these big oils are going to be the leaders in tomorrow's technology, it'll be by coincidence. And I say that respectfully. They're phenomenal companies, and I don't even know why we want them to do this stuff. The world still needs oil and gas. They should eliminate their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. They clearly should be more aggressive in eliminating methane. That is, I think, a real critique that is deserving. But the idea that you'd want them to do, I mean, honestly, I don't know your company, Simon, but I find it much more interesting. You're much more likely to have a unique business model that figures out location, that figures out the consumer angle. You can get expertise. It's not like these companies are adding massive amounts of employees. So there's a lot of petroleum engineering. I noticed in last year's pivot, there were a lot of the drilling companies involved. So you can get the expertise. The idea that you'd want any of the super majors to definitively go into this or any other area, I don't understand the mindset. I don't think you'll have a successful transition if you're waiting for the super majors or any big oil company to lead the way on it or even participate personally.
Could I come back with one quick thing, Simon?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, because the other thing that goes through my mind is, well, where do they like to get involved in stuff that uses subsurface and wells, has a load of risk and doesn't pay a return? And the answer is carbon storage. And why do they want to do that? Well, they'll get somebody else to take a lot of the risk if they can, probably the government, right? And they have to do it to create a route for the gas. So it's strategic, it's critically strategic. It's like having a pipeline for your resource. So to do that, right, and that's long-term, high risk, needs subsurface and wells, rubbish returns, but they've got reasons for doing it.
Yeah.
Simon, let me just build upon that. It'll be 1 second, which is
sure.
The mechanism to get them involved is their disclosure, their claim that they're going to be zero on Scope 1 and Scope 2. And I'm going to leave Scope 3 aside for this discussion. You're not going to get to zero Scope 1 and Scope 2 just from capping this and doing that. You're going to have some amount of this, quote, other stuff. And I do think geothermal in that respect is interesting. There's frankly, to me, it won't be fast enough for climate types, but it will be that zero claim that they're all making in their own publications, voluntarily on their own, perhaps demanded by their investors. That's how you'll get a price on carbon, because you'll de facto get it, because you're not going to get to zero on your own. I'm not an engineer, but that would be my sense. You're going to have to figure out some of this other stuff. And then I think the question you're asking is, how can geothermal be part of that portfolio mix? To me, it's going to have to start with a more honest assessment of what 24/7, 365 power really means and what it doesn't mean, back to the previous answer.
Yeah.
It's like planting trees.
Yeah.
But it gives you something more.
Helen, so you're interested in infrastructure projects with geothermal. Who are you looking to build the pipeline of those projects, and how did they get started?
So I think that's a really interesting question. And I think one of, going back to the previous question, the thing that's really held back infrastructure investment into geothermal has been the resource risk. So that problem needs to be addressed, but moving to the question you're asking now around the pipeline of projects, I think what has happened traditionally in the industry is you've got local developers who are capital constrained and for that reason are developing one project at a time. It's very slow, it's very binary. It's very difficult to get those projects funded, going back to the point I made just now, because the resource risk is purely linked to that project. There is no way to diversify that risk because there is only a single project. So solving the resource risk problem will partially be done by getting enough projects being developed and enabling investors to build a diversified portfolio, or enabling insurers to diversify that risk across a number of projects. I think the geothermal space has obviously been around for a long time, but it is small and it is very geographically concentrated. For geothermal to make a difference, it has to grow far more quickly than organic growth within the sector can deliver. And that will mean bringing in expertise from the oil and gas sector and also from the renewables and the utility sector. And you really need both of those skill sets to deliver these projects. You need the understanding of the subsurface, and then you need the understanding of the offtake and structuring these projects.
Right, very good. So we need the skills and expertise of oil and gas, but it sounds like we're all sort of gravitating towards it's not actually within an oil and gas company that it's going to come from. So there seems to be a space here for some unicorns to develop and get busy deploying this capital. Jay, let's go over to the thermal energy part of the there's two twins here. There's geothermal power, and then there's geothermal thermal energy. Dave drew some differences earlier. What differences do you see? How are the constraints on shallow geothermal thermal energy networks? How is that different, and what does it mean for potential business models?
The number one thing I see as different is it seems that the public, or even investors, or even engineers and scientists often get that high temperature geothermal can create electricity. That seems to be the most common understanding of high temperature. If you think about the other renewables that everybody knows about, solar and wind, most people equate that with creating electricity. So to get somebody's head around the fact that we're dealing with thermal energy and that thermal energy is truly baseload is probably the highest lift. And when I first conceptualized thermal energy networks, which is the distribution of ambient temperature thermal energy for heating and cooling in domestic hot water, almost 35 years ago, I was explaining it to an anchor on a television interview, and because he had asked me, he said, "When do you think everybody in the U.S. will be able to have geothermal heat pumps like this apartment complex?" And I said, "When it becomes a utility, then we will all be able to have access to it." So beyond that, we have worked long and hard, and many people know that in New York, just early this month, New York's just passed a law called the Thermal Energy Networks and Jobs Act of 2022, which is essentially paving the way for thermal energy pipelines to be run throughout the state to every building and home in New York. And we see that as following closely behind in other states, and even we're working on some federal legislation right now. So utilities, I would be remiss if I didn't say the utilities that get this, such as the utility in Tennessee that I just mentioned, see this as a huge lost opportunity to monetize thermal energy, both coming into buildings and leaving buildings. It is, once they understand it, it's a technology and an opportunity for earning power that is really the final frontier on energy distribution.
That's excellent, Jay. So a market change that had to happen in the state of New York was for the utility to be able to play in the thermal energy space. Excellent point. Helen, are you all interested in thermal energy infrastructure projects?
Absolutely. And I think, I'm not alone in that. I think the reason you haven't seen as many of them is they are hard to develop. There aren't as many heat users out there. And in particular, there aren't that many heat users who could give you a 20-year offtake contract that would make you comfortable spending millions of pounds digging a big hole in the ground. There are some out there, but they have been few and far between. Another difficulty you've got at the moment in the market is district heating is huge in parts of Europe. Most of the pricing for that has been traditionally based on gas, and that works well because you price relative to gas and your off-taker gets comfortable that they'll always be paying slightly less than they are at the moment. So it works for them, and it makes you comfortable as well that they won't revert to gas when the pricing changes. I think an interesting thing that's happening at the moment is if you're structuring a 20-year contract, is gas going to be your alternative heat supply in 20 years? I don't know.
Very good. Yeah. Dave or Arjun, would you like to come into the thermal energy as a...
Yeah, I mean, as I thought about it, Simon, I was thinking through the kind of, which companies would be interested in geothermal, right? I didn't think utilities would be interested in hot, dry rock stuff particularly, but I thought they would be interested in this. And, that electricity, gas and water providers, they all touch customers, they touch homes, they touch businesses. And so they've got that bit. And actually from a subset, and they don't really need the big returns sometimes because they get help from the local, in Europe at least, they get help from local governments and cities and so forth, right? I mean, Munich's got 50,000 homes, I think, with quite a lot of geothermal heat going in, hot water. And they want to get the whole city like that. But that takes quite a push in terms of local help. It's not just companies and private investors, I think. But it seems to me that it's a lower risk thing to do because that source of heat is really quite ubiquitous if you get to a reasonable depth. There are risks still, but it's nothing like the same risk profile as your hot, dry rock projects, which is sort of point source power. I probably said enough.
No, that's good. Good.
I don't, just to disagree slightly there.
Yeah, go.
So,
you know more than I do.
So I think from the technical side, that could well be the case. I think from the offtake side, often there is more risk attached with a heat project. If you're producing power, you can feed it into the grid. You can be pretty comfortable that offtaker is going to be there in 20 years' time. If they mess you around, they're messing everyone in the industry around, there'll be an uproar. If you've spent millions of pounds digging your hole to provide heat to one company, that company has massive leverage over you. So you need to make sure that contract is rock solid and they as a business, or not a business if they're a different type of offtaker, are rock solid.
Yeah, great. Arjun, you look as if you had something to add.
No, I think I'd just add it's kind of this diversity of opportunity in geothermal that I just found intuitively appealing, again, listening to the panels this week. But I think what Jay presented in terms of a specific policy change that should enable action, like that's clearly the first step, right? And so I think we need 10x or 1,000x that, but it's the type of thing that I think does start to attract interest. So,
yeah, I would like to add something. May I, Simon?
Yeah.
And I think that even on this panel, I don't think that people realize with a thermal energy network that it's not just about a big hole. One of the examples that helped the assembly in New York to pass this was we have a project that involves 2,500 apartments in the middle of Manhattan that need to turn off their boilers, which are using natural gas to decarbonize. they need 4 megawatts of thermal energy to get them through the winter for domestic hot water and comfort heating. Meanwhile, across the street, the US Postal Service has a distribution center that, because of equipment and data, is putting off 8 megawatts of thermal energy through its cooling towers all winter long. All we have to do is connect those buildings hydronically, and that entire apartment complex can turn off their boilers, and Con Ed can monetize that thermal energy that's being wasted right now. That is the secret that few people realize about a thermal energy network. It is using waste energy from buildings to decarbonize other buildings. And it, in most city centers, that certainly all that we've studied, even during the middle of the winter, they are cooling dominant, meaning there is more heat being exhausted that could be used for heating and domestic hot water than there is than is needed. So it's a remarkable study.
Dave.
That makes me think, and this isn't flippant, but it makes me think of the huge volumes of produced water with oil fields.
Right.
But
exactly,
the trouble is that your
Dave.
users aren't typically sitting on top of them. Right. So you need to find a big oil field producing loads of extra water that's all very hot next to a major industrial user or conurbation. Right. And then you've got something that you can do with, because the oil industry produces huge amount of heat in all that water.
Yes.
Very good. So, I'm glad that we've got into how policy and authorities can help shape the market. That's an important outcome from this. So we got only a few minutes left. We're heading towards the wrap. Anybody like to have a stab at describing the perfect geothermal energy company that's going to make this happen? What does it look like? Go on.
I think
Arjun.
it'd be different. It would be different for the kind of stuff Jay's talking about, and the power.
Yeah.
Right. And for me, actually, it isn't one company. I think it's a coming together of partnerships of different people who are playing different bits in the chain. From the infrastructure investors who'll come in at the right time with capital, but early on, you probably need, it's more of a venture capital, small scale up businesses who are eliminating some of that early risk with investors who are prepared to take some of that risk, but we need to find a way to get the returns that are commensurate somehow. And I don't know how you do that. I mean, that's where governments have actually got to step in, I think, if you want this to happen.
Yeah.
I think I just add that it's going to have to be European focused to start. I actually think Jay's example is an awesome one. I have an apartment in New York. To heat the top floor, the people on the first floor, it's 8,000 degrees. They got their windows open. There's so much inefficiency, but there's not a crisis, right? So you're doing this because you care about carbon and climate and the environment. And that's not a good enough reason, to be honest, to motivate the kind of aggressive change that I think is needed, where you clearly have crisis in Europe. You've had some unfortunate policy choices that has led them to this path, and they are where they are. So if you're going to try and eliminate Russian gas, or if it's going to be eliminated on its own, you're going to have to provide some solutions to businesses and people pretty darn quick. And I would think it's that type of crisis environment that we are going to be in for a decade that can accelerate the type of change. So whether it's business focused or home focused, I think that is where it's going to start. And of course, in Europe, we do have the opportunity for a more supportive policy backdrop than I think you have in the US as a general comment. And then by the time you start getting to the rest of the world, you're going to start with your least expensive forms of power. And realistically, that's probably not anything in the renewable space. So I would say Europe is an obvious place to start, and that would then characterize the type of company.
Counterintuitively, pretty darn quick might be easier with geothermal than it is with a lot of other things.
Yeah.
Nuclear takes, anyway,
So let's wrap this session up. The time has flown. I hope the audience has enjoyed this as much as I have. So I'd like to give each of the panelists 1 minute to summarize and really maybe the question is to each of you, what's your one big takeaway from this discussion and perhaps other discussions during the week if you have participated in them? And let's do it in the reverse of our introductions. And so, Jay, may I start with you, please? What's your big takeaway?
My big takeaway is that in order to do this, the final frontier of energy distribution is thermal energy. That means pipelines filled with water that are carrying BTUs, very much similar to a water main. Once we interconnect the buildings with ambient temperature pipelines, we have the opportunity then to do anything outside of the city for a power source, for supply or rejection of energy that we want to, but we are losing opportunities until we have these buildings interconnected thermally. And that's my big takeaway. And that's what we're doing. And that's what's getting traction.
Excellent. Thank you, Jay. Dave.
I wasn't expecting to be next. My big takeaway, gosh, there've been so many. Probably it's, when I started on this, I expected to think that big oil would be the natural scaler upper of all of this. And I don't think they are. I really don't think they are. I don't think it'll work, despite the skill sets that they have.
Yeah.
For all the reasons we've discussed.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. And it's my ability to reverse the alphabet that calls me to pick on you next. Actually, there's been quite a number of discussion points and questions about the presence or absence of big oil, and so I'm really glad that these points have come out. The audience are really interested in this particular topic. And as I get my letters back to in correct order, Helen, what's your big takeaway?
Sure. So something I learned in this session was how poorly the oil and gas industry had performed over the last decade or so. So that was very interesting. I think also just reinforcing a view I had previously that we simply, to deliver real change in this sector, there needs to be more development work going on, developing these projects. They have a multi-year development horizon. If developers aren't getting funded and doing that work now, it's not going to make an impact.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And finally, Arjun.
I think my big takeaway was, the goal is to have energy available for all, affordable, reliable, and from secure sources, ideally with as small of a carbon environmental footprint as possible. And prior to Pivot 2022, my view would have been solar and wind will at best be a niche technology, but to really have reliability, availability, you're going to need people to buy into nuclear and have carbon capture to eliminate the emissions on traditional oil and gas, deal with methane as well. I probably still believe that to a large degree, but I think this whole geothermal topic is absolutely fascinating. Its ability to serve as baseload, thermal, storage for solar and wind instead of batteries. It is an absolutely fascinating area. What I don't know is, until my friend Rob Santangelo of Credit Suisse was on the previous discussion, this is not talked about on Wall Street in any sort of meaningful way. And it should be. I think this is an absolutely fascinating area, but it's going to take a mindset shift from, I'm going to say, and I don't mean to be insulting, from the climate crowd that is touting sort of solar and wind as the be all and end all. It's absurd to think that they are. No sane human being could possibly agree that that's all we need. And if you don't want nuclear, or if you're not going to buy into it, but you do want renewables, and there's only so much carbon capture and direct air capture you can do, then this probably is going to have to be part of the solution. That is something I didn't appreciate prior to this, which is why I've called it a messy energy transition. I think we were on track to default to just ongoing crude oil, natural gas. And by the way, coal hasn't even peaked, right? And so geothermal should be part of the conversation. And how do you help reframe the discussion so that at least it's not about Wall Street, but at least the Wall Street people will start getting interested in it?
Very, very good. So I need to call the session to a close. Thanks very much to the panelists. It's been a fabulous discussion, surpassed my expectations, which were high. And very many thanks to the audience for your listening and your participation. Thank you all.